Hello there, welcome to today's class. Today you will be learning about written poetry, and at the end of the class you should be able to 1. Read and explain a section of poems, 2. Identify the language of poetry, and 3. Write simple poetry. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. Kids, have you heard that rhyme before? Well, it started off as what we call a poem. I am sure you've heard the words poems and poetry before. But have you really stopped to consider what they mean? Or even if they mean the same or different things? Well, I'll tell you. Written poetry is a creative process of using short lines of words to express feelings, thoughts, and stories, while poems are writings produced from the process called poetry. A person who writes poems is called a poet. Poetry makes use of figurative languages, symbolisms, and rhymes. Hence, poems usually have a deeper meaning than what we see at first glance. This deeper meaning that is seen in a poem is what we call poetic language. Poetic language can be said to be unique and figurative, as it may differ from poet to poet. For example, a poet may write, "Mother's scarf is crying," or "Mother's shoes are drowning." And what she means is that it is raining from the clouds or the grounds are wet. Here, the poet just uses figurative language to compare the earth to a mother, the clouds to the scarf she uses on her head, and the ground to the shoes she wears on her feet. Isn't that fascinating? Just how deep poetic language can be. Another interesting thing about poetry is the use of rhyme, which is the art of ending each poetic line with a similar sound pattern. For example, in this poem, "Mother's scarf is crying, mother's shoes are drowning, mother's seeds turn green, mother's smile is seen." You notice a sound pattern that rhymes with the pronunciation with each other, as the first line ends with a sound that is similar to the second line, and the third line is similar to the fourth line. No wonder poems are fun to read. Now we've looked at what poetry, poems, poetic language, and rhymes are. Let's take a look at a popular poem titled Africa by a popular poet called Raphael Amato, and see what we can learn from it. Let's read together. I once saw a maiden, dark and comely, sitting by the wayside, sad and lonely. Oh, pretty maiden, so dark and comely. Why sit by the wayside, sad and lonely? I am neither sad nor lonely, she said, but living, sir, among the deaf amid dumb, relentlessly watching this shameless dead, making my warm heart grow very cold and numb. Kids, do you notice the use of rhyme all through the lines? Can you explain the meaning of the poem based on what you've learned from the figurative language of poetry? Now, let's walk you through the meaning of the poem. The poem talks about Africa as a continent using the word dark and comely maiden to refer to the skin color of Africans and the natural resource attractiveness of Africa, thereby comparing Africa to a dark and pretty lady. The poem then goes on to talk about how people might misunderstand Africa to be sad and lonely, when what is really wrong with Africa is the fact that the people living in Africa do not listen to or see what Africa really wants. This is seen in the 5th and 6th line, where the maiden, who is actually Africa, says, "I am neither sad nor lonely," she said, "but living, sir, among the deaf amid dumb." What Africa really wants in this case is for Africa to hear what Africa wants by paying more attention to the African cultures, values and norms and not acting like the deaf and dumb. The poem then ends by saying Africa feels cold and numb because Africans are dying shameless deaths as a result of copying others and not listening or seeing what the African continent really wants. Generally, we can say the poem is about telling Africans to listen to and embrace their original culture and values to avoid unpleasant consequences like death. This is the meaning of the poem Africa by Raphael Amato. Kids, did you find the process of unraveling the poem meaning interesting? Do you think you can now write a poem by yourself with the use of poetic language and rhyme? Well, I trust you can. So, write a poem and show it to your English teacher and friends to see if they can explain it. Kids, with that we've come to the end of our lesson on written poetry, where you have been taught what poetry and poems are, how to recognize a poetic language, and how to explain a poem. See you in the next lesson.